Oh, money, 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 money. Morning, everyone. It's good to see all of you this morning, and we are going to talk about money today for this theologue. Not theologue, golly, new thing. It's early. Sorry, everyone. Haven't had my coffee yet. Don't really drink coffee, but I feel like I need it today. Regardless, good to be here with all of you. I'm excited to talk about this. I was thinking about this because just like last week, all these studies are coming out. I wonder if it's because it's like the end of the fiscal year, and so everyone's like releasing all of these things. But we'll talk about that study in a little bit. This is going to be one that's kind of more of a deep dive biblically on money, but really we're only going to look at two passages. So the first one that's going to kind of set us up is from the New Testament, a famous passage from the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus. So let me pull that up for us so we can take a look at it. This is from Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. And Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." So, very famous passage, right? Sometimes people think of this in the King James version. You cannot serve both God and mammon, right? This idea here being that these two things are opposed. And the Bible talks a lot about money. It's one of the things that's mentioned a lot, but it's one of the things we hate talking about the most when it comes to looking at what the Bible has to say, because money is important for a lot of us, and that's what we're going to look at in a little bit. One of the things, though, that I think is crucial to understanding this, because a lot of us know these first two parts, but the part about the eye is usually the part that's forgotten, the part where Jesus talks about the eye. If you'll notice, the NIV notes help us understand this pretty well. Jesus is using this as a metaphor for understanding, our heart, what our hearts are valuing. Because as you can see, it has a footnote here. When Jesus mentions that word for healthy, it also is a word that implies being generous. And when he says unhealthy, it's a word that implies being stingy, right? Being very covetous of your own money and wealth and things like that, that you have to be willing to give these things up. And it's why this is always a heart issue. And because it's a heart issue, it makes it hard to diagnose unless you yourself are actually aware of it. And most people will tend to say that they're not aware of it, or they don't want to be aware of it, because being challenged about money is one of the hardest things that someone can be challenged about, because it's so just normal in our culture to care a lot about money. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting here is that I think that if you read this and you kind of want to put it away, if you're wondering if this is like something that you struggle with, if you read passages like this and your first kind of instinct is to try and explain them away, that probably means that you value money too much. And there are worse examples of this, but there's the famous one of the camel through the eye of a needle. And some people have gone to say actually what that is it's talking about a smaller gate in Jerusalem that a camel is hard to get through, which was called the eye of the needle. And so it's still very possible for rich people to get to, that type of thing. If you know the passage, Jesus says it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel through an eye of a needle. Of course, like the needle being super tiny. So some people will try and reinterpret that in order to be more generous or to find a way to kind of smooth the way in. Now, I want to be also clear about another thing, and I really like to push this point, because in the United States, when we hear about this, we only think of people like Jeff Bezos or people in the 1% or, millionaires or something like that. You have to remember, compared to Jesus's time and compared to most people around the world, Americans are extremely wealthy. If you have if you're making $45,000 a year, you're making way more than most people around the world. And that's not even that, in the United States, that's not considered a lot, right? And so I think that we tend to be like, well, we're not rich, so this doesn't apply to us. It's like, no, this does apply to everyone. And this is why we have to be really careful with how we go about. And so this is reflected in the way that we look at things and the ways that we view, and that reflects our inward soul, right? And that's why Jesus really pushes this. Something to note about this is this follows, not directly, there's 2 verses about fasting, but this follows the Lord's Prayer. And right before the Lord's Prayer is another commentary on money. And so just if you look at Matthew chapter 6, you can see that the Lord's Prayer, which we usually take out of context and just kind of say, which is fine. I mean, it is how we should pray, so that's not a bad thing. Within the context, it falls within this idea of like having things in the world and money and comfort and not worrying, and that's the prayer that Jesus tells us to pray. And that's why there's that give us today our daily bread section in there, I'm sure, because one of the things we struggle with is, do we really think God is going to give us this today our daily bread, or do we have to make sure that we prepare and save and earn it and all these other types of things, right? And so it's just interesting. So the reason I was thinking about this is to talk just about our first kind of thing today, which is this Wall Street Journal came out with an article, and I can't access it. You might, I don't know. You have to have a Wall Street Journal subscription. So I've been relying on people from Twitter who have been posting screenshots of the data. But essentially, Wall Street Journal did a survey of American values and where people think. And most people have been sharing this image, which is the percent of people who say these values are very important to them, like very important, like so the top of the list. And you can see that patriotism has gone down quite a bit since this is 1998 to 2003, right? 70% 1988 to 38%, 62% to 39% for religion. Having children went from 59 to 30%. Community involvement is really funny if you look at the timeline, because it was like 47% in 1998. And then in 2019, 62%. It's really important to be in community. COVID happens, dives down to 27%, which is kind of funny. And then you'll see a steady growth. The only one that's going up consistently and didn't take a dive at all is money, right? It went from 31 to 41 to 43. And it's interesting, I don't think that this correlates money thing to the drop in religion and patriotism. I think that part of this can be explained by the 90s were a pretty good time economically. And so I think if a lot of people are feeling secure, they're less willing to do that. But as time got on, even though we have gotten richer, there's more feelings of insecurity, I think, especially with the way that the economy is kind of right now and inflation, whatever. So people have been valuing it more. Of course, there's been big booms in here too, but it's just interesting to see that grow. Now, if you look at this, you're like, oh no, the sky is falling. It's not as bad as that. This is the important qualifier is the very important value, because if you go to the next thing, this is the thing. They tell you how they phrase the question, and then they tell you how it works. And so you can actually see here that they have a net, which is just like people who said it was very important and people who said it was somewhat important mixed into one. And you can see actually that a lot of these values, so if you're like one of the people that's like the sky is falling, a lot of these values are pretty widely held by the majority of Americans, even if like they don't think they're the most important thing in the world, right? So the vast majority, like 2/3 pretty much across the board, besides in religion, or even more than that, with stuff like self-fulfillment, which is 91% of Americans say that's important, is still important to most people. I think, though, the only what something reveals is that a lot of the money thing is interesting because it's gone up. It's right next to self-fulfillment and tolerance for others, which are pretty core American values, and community involvement, like money is probably is one of the lowest ones, right? It's up there with, it's just self-fulfillment, tolerance, and money are the ones, like, people would never, like, only 2% of people would say money's not important at all. And I want to know who that 2% is that they interviewed, because, like, man, that's tough for me even, right? So you'll see here that, a lot of people find all sorts of things very important: tolerance, hard work, marriage, self-fulfillment, community involvement, which just probably went from very to somewhat. Patriotism went from very to somewhat, or it's actually kind of split between the two. I wouldn't be surprised if, like, this is, I mean, the problem with patriotism is it really matters a lot on politics, and when people are particularly divided, that's where that's going to kind of go down. Religion is interesting because it's at a lower point, and it's the lowest one of the net. But you'll see that belief in God is higher, about 5 percentage points. But I wanted to talk about money because, if this trend holds, if this trend holds that they have here, then we shouldn't really be surprised by that. That's something that's kind of normal. Now, for Christians, right, this is something Jesus warns us about. For Christians, I think it's important for us to ask ourselves when it comes to money, do we think that there's an upper limit? I always like challenging people on this point because I don't think we usually think about it all that much. We talked about this at Young Adults last night too. Do we think there's an upper limit to the amount of money that someone is allowed to have? And I'm not talking about, like, the things that you might see people where they'll talk about, like, billionaires are immoral. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about as a Christian, right? The outside world is the outside world. The secular world is the secular world. I really don't think that there's much that we can comment on there meaningfully. But within the Christian sphere, how much money do we think is actually acceptable for a Christian to have? So, for instance, this is a super yacht, which I've seen valued, it's called the Eclipse. It's valued anywhere from, like, 300 or 400 million all the way to, like, $1.5 billion. Do you think it would be acceptable for a Christian to own the Eclipse? And I think that when I've had these conversations, one of the interesting things is that we are supposed to use money clearly in the Bible when we get it, right, to serve God. That's what it's used for. It's not meant to be used for massive kind of vanity type projects and things like that. And of course, there are things that people might want that would be nice. But I think one of the things that where this is really challenging is how we rationalize these spending of money to ourselves, right? And then how we actually go about it. And I bring this up because I want to talk about Ecclesiastes. So Ecclesiastes chapter 5 is a wisdom book, and in the Old Testament. And I wanted to take a look at these verses. So I'm going to read these things for us and comment on them. If you see the poor oppressed in a district and justice and rights denied, do not be surprised at such things, which is a crazy thing to say because, so many people will, like, go out there and learn something about the world and they'll be shocked that it happens. And the person who wrote this, right, sometimes it's called the philosopher, sometimes it's traditionally attributed to Solomon, but we don't really know. This writer says, no, don't be surprised about that. Don't be surprised, because one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them both others are higher still. So people, they kind of look out for themselves or look out for the people above them, and they don't really care about people at the bottom, right? The increase from the land is taken by all. The king himself profits from the fields. So people who get stuff from not working the land, right? Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. Big word in Ecclesiastes is vanity or meaninglessness. And he talks about how life is meaningless and that all these things are meaningless. And he talks about wealth here being meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. I think, like, our best example of this is the modern world, where we just make so much stuff that we consume so much and so rapidly of, that this is kind of been proven, right? That the more you get, the more consumption that drives. And what benefit are they to the owners except to feast their eyes on them? So just like stuff that you have, just so you can look at it. I'm like, you know, as much as I like to talk, I'm guilty of this, right? I have stuff that I just like to look at that's very frivolous and, you know, meaningless in the grand scheme of things. The sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether they eat little or much. But as for the rich, their abundance permits them no sleep. It kind of gets to the bottom of that. Usually when people get more money, they struggle more with, I think, holding on to that, and also kind of what there's this temptation to make sure that you hold on to as much as you possibly can, or to increase, because I think that, like, what people who are able to become wealthy are people who are very good with money. And I think being part of someone, well, that's not always the case. Sometimes you're just a sheik in the desert and you sit on a bunch of oil, right? But I would say, like, for a lot of people, barring you're not some weird government official or something like that where you're just getting money because you have connections, like, usually these people are really smart because they've invested and built and worked, and they know that this is actually true. They know that money can very easily be as lost as quickly as it is gained. And so people who value this stuff really cling and hold on to that, and permits them no sleep, as in they're stressed out about this. And I think even those of us without a lot of money have seen this, right? I mean, that's why I asked the question about the yacht. It's like, how much is too much? And usually I think we might like to say, well, yeah, you can't have the yacht, but, like, you know, something, we'll try and use a lesser kind of thing to stand in for it and make that. But even people, you know, even you could problematize that. I have seen grievous evil under the sun, he continues. Wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners. And I think that's a really powerful thing. Wealth is hoarded to the harm of its owners, right? We usually, when we think of hoarding wealth, we think of it as taking from other people. But here, it's actually defined as when you hoard wealth, it hurts yourself, because you end up believing that is where your security lies. Or wealth lost through some misfortune, so that when they have children, there's nothing left for them to inherit. Again, we don't see these stories as much, but believe me, they happen all the time, where people who have a lot lose it all and are kind of stuck in a place where they can't actually do or have the lifestyle that they're used to or anything like that. And then here's a famous phrase, right? Everyone comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands. And I think that this is probably the biggest gotcha within the religious sphere when it comes to materialism and wealth and things like that, is that how much of this is actually going to help you in your walk with God, and how much of this can you take with you? Nothing, right? You can't take anything with you. And we're not Egyptians, right? We don't believe that when we die, we're going to be able to be buried with all our stuff and it's going to come with us in the afterlife, right? And that's why the way you live and the way you use your money is so important, because you might have the eclipse, right? But, like, can you take the eclipse with you when you die? No. And I think that, you know, the owner of the eclipse, I think it's like some Russian autocrat or something like that. You know, he might be like, well, I don't believe I don't believe in God or something like that. Well, whether or not you do, God exists, right? And God will take account of the way that people acted, and the way that you use things like this, and the money that you use for this rather than for other things might be bad. And I'm not saying that, you know, I think the way that you would use the money is important, not just to, you know, throw it to the wind, right? Money goes somewhere. You want to make sure it goes to something that's right. So you want to be conscientious about that. But, like, a lot of people will use this or use excuses in order to justify, I think, the behavior that's talked about in Ecclesiastes. And what I mean by that is, I meant a lot of people who for instance, when I was posed this question by one of my friends about this yacht, I said, well, what if you use the yacht to like bring like poor families on vacations, right? And I think that would be great. So if you're a Christian that owns a, $500 million yacht, that's probably something you should be doing, is like using it as a way for people who can't afford to do these types of things, as a way of being able to give them experiences that they could have, or like for pastors or their families who can't afford to do this type of stuff, right? I think that'd be a great way to use a $1.5 billion yacht, if that's as much as this thing actually costs. But I hear myself say that, and then I instantly ask myself, would I actually use it for? Hopefully I would. But if I actually had this, would I actually want to use it that way? Or would I just love sailing around with like me and a group of friends and like my staff? I assume this thing has like a staff, and that's it, right? Being waited on hand and foot. I'd probably much prefer that, because then you don't have to put up with people, right? Many of us would do that. And I think you can extrapolate that out to all sorts of different things. One of the ways I've seen that just is with people who want to go to medical or law school, right? They'll say, well, I want to become a lawyer and I want to help people, or I want to become a doctor and I want to go and be a missionary medical doctor and stuff like that. And then they'll go to law school or medical school, and then you'll check in with them a few years after that, and they're not doing that, right? They're working at some Big Ten law firm, or they're at a hospital somewhere making tons of money. And I think that I don't necessarily blame them for that. Although I do think that I think people should be honest when they go into these things, or be understanding that when you're there, this temptation that Christ talks about, this temptation of money, is strong, and it can actually guide us away from doing what we are supposed to do, right? So all their days they eat in darkness with great frustration, affliction, and anger. This too is grievous evil. As everyone comes, so they depart. And what do they gain? Since they toil for the wind, all their days they eat in darkness with great frustration, affliction, and anger. This is what I observe to be good. So this is what he observes to be good in light of like that evil that he has seen, where people lust after money and try and hold on to it, right? That it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has given them, for this is their lot. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, it's kind of interesting that an ability to enjoy them is actually kind of a gift, without having to worry about where it's going to go, right? I think that this is the ability to have wealth and understand that it's not yours, and that it's not worried about holding on to it and hoarding it, but rather just I'm enjoying it and using it for God's purposes. That's a gift from God, he says. They seldom reflect on the days of their life, because God keeps them occupied with the gladness of heart. One of the big things with Ecclesiastes concerning things is that people end up becoming too focused on things that are meaningless or vain. And so the writer's big point here is that they don't have to reflect on the meaninglessness of their life or the vanity of their life, because they're focused on kind of these simple things, not distracted by a lot of these things that are vain. And so I think that this is a great passage. Ecclesiastes 5:8-20 is a great passage when you think about wealth. And I think, obviously this is on my mind because we're doing a lot of stewardship stuff recently. But I think we should always ask ourselves the yacht question, and then bring it down, like 250 million, 100 million. Can you even own a yacht? Can Christians own a yacht, right? How much can you have in a bank account? And I think that we then start to think about how we're using our money in a really tangible and interesting way. The Bible does not condemn rich people for being rich. What it does condemn, though, is it condemns the love of money. And as this values poll shows, that's not just the rich. That's a lot of us, about 43% of us. Very important. And I think that it's important for us to remember that that isn't the end-all, be-all in our lives, and that we do not take anything with us. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I'm glad you guys were able to join me. And I will hope to see you guys on Sunday and next week for more stuff. So have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and peace out.